We're in the midst of a message series called Minor Prophets, where we are looking at a minor prophet every week and talking about the story that is there. And we are in the home stretch, the last three, and they all come from a very specific time period in the life of the nation of Israel. And that's kind of a misnomer, because by the time we get here, there's not much of a nation, and it's not really Israel. Now, it is God's people, and sometimes we just assume that the name Israel is synonymous for God's people. But in the Old Testament, there is a lengthy story that gets us to this point. And I just want to take a few minutes here at the beginning. I want to give you a 5-minute history of the Old Testament, because we're at the end. And in order to know the end, you got to know where you began, right? Like, it's hard to understand the ending of anything if you don't know the beginning. Now, some of you are the read the first chapter and then go to the end of the book and find out what happens kind of person. I got any of those people in the house this morning? All right. I know somebody in my family who will remain nameless. Don't tell Susan I was talking about her. Who, while we're watching a movie in a theater, will pull up the page that gives the synopsis of the plot to check out and to make sure it's going to end well. Now, first of all, most of the movies we see are animated Disney movies. They're not going to end poorly, right? But it's hard to understand the ending without the beginning. And so, just kind of give you a little history. Now, I want to start at the beginning. Genesis 1 starts where? It starts in the beginning, right? That's the first words of the Bible, in the beginning. Now, we call Genesis 1 through 11 prehistory. Now, we don't call it prehistory because it was before history. We call it that because we don't have good dates for it. So there's nothing in there that can tell us for sure this happened at 2,100 years before Christ. Now, I know some people will take the genealogies and they'll count backwards and get to an exact date. The issue with that is sometimes in there we may have missed a person in the genealogy. It may just given us a representative genealogy. It may be that those years mean something different as they're understood in the original language. And so we call that prehistory. But history for the Old Testament really starts in Genesis chapter 12. Now again, when I say history starts, I don't mean that Genesis 1 through 11 didn't happen. It did. Absolutely 100% happened. It's all true. It's all real. It's a real story, real history. But dating begins in Genesis chapter 12. And here's what I want you to understand. In Genesis chapter 12, Abram is called by God to become his people. His family would become his people. Now think about this. That was 1800 BC. Sometimes we think about Abram way, way back there, right? Like ancient history. But Abram was closer to the birth of Jesus than we are. Abram was 1,800 years before Jesus. We're 2,000 years after. And so Abram is called by God, and you know that story if you grew up in church, right? Abram's called by God. God gives him some promises. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you more kids than you can count. I'm going to bless everyone on earth through you. And so the beginning of Genesis chapter 12 tells us the story of a family, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, but he likes 2 more than the others because they were born to his favorite wife. Now, that's probably an issue we need to talk about at some time, but we don't have time today to talk about favorite wives, all right? And so he has 2, and those 2 are Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph is not liked by his brothers because he's liked by his dad, and they sell him into slavery when they decide not to kill him. He goes to Egypt. God uses that to protect the people when a famine happens. But because of Joseph being in Egypt, the whole family ends up in Egypt where they prosper under the rule of the Egyptians. But eventually a king comes to mind that doesn't know who they are. Somewhere around 1,250 years before Christ, the king starts to impose this terrible sentences on them. He tries to stop them from having children. And out of the midst of that, a guy rises to be their leader named Moses. He delivers them through God's hand, was God's instrument to deliver them. They leave Egypt. They go towards the promised land. They cross the Red Sea. Something bad happens because they don't follow God. And so as they walk away from God, God says, that's fine. We'll let you wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That generation dies. Joshua takes them into the promised land. They get to the promised land, and the 12 tribes, named after the 12 sons, disperse into various parts of the land of the promised land that would become Israel. And in those different spots, they rule themselves according to the laws that they want. The problem is, after Joshua dies, there's no good leader, and there's no leader within those tribes, and it goes to chaos. The book of Judges tells us that every man did what was right in his own eyes. And before long, it is utter chaos, to the point that at the end of the book of Judges, which we talked about last summer, you get to the place where there is a girl literally quartered, or not quartered, what's quartered times 3? 12th. She's 12th. She's pulled into 12 different pieces and sent to the various tribes, and there is all-out civil war. And the people said, we need a king. Everybody else got a king. We need a king. And so they get a king. 1 and 2 Samuel tells the story of the first kings of Israel, Saul, who was chosen for the wrong reason, that was chosen with the wrong motives, that was chosen with the wrong characteristics. He's terrible. He does some good things at the beginning, but he doesn't follow the Lord. He's not a spiritual leader. God anoints a new man, David, to become king, and in the year 1000 BC, David becomes king, and he sets what seems to be everything right. Now, David wasn't a perfect king by any means, but he was a good king. He was a king after God's heart. After he dies, his son Solomon takes over the throne. Solomon builds the temple of God. Solomon builds a palace for himself. Solomon becomes one of the wealthiest men in all the earth. People travel from all over to find them. Israel becomes the new up-and-coming power on the global scene, and everybody thinks they are destined to be this great nation. The problem is, when he dies, his son takes over and doesn't do a good job, and the kingdom splits. So you got a northern group. 10 tribes go north. 2 tribes stay south. The 10 tribes to the north have terrible king after terrible king after terrible king. And after 200 years, literally 200 years after they are established, they are destroyed by the Assyrian Empire from the north. The southern kingdom does a little bit better. They have some good kings, some Hezekiah, some Josiah. They have some people that help them, but progressively the kings get worse. Before long, they're in the same place their northern neighbors were, and by 586 BC, the Babylonians, the new guys on the block, come and destroy them completely. And when I say destroy completely, I mean rip down the walls of Jerusalem. I mean take the temple that Solomon built to the ground. Steal everything they can in the midst of it. In the process, in the years before that, they're taking some of the best and brightest from Jerusalem to Babylon to make them Babylonian. One of those guys' names is Daniel. That's how we know a lot of what happens in this time, is he wrote a book about it. And the Israelites now have no land. Both have been destroyed. They have no way to practice their religion. They have abandoned the Lord completely, it seems. But God promised that it would not last long. And in 539, he brings a guy to Persia's throne who destroy the Babylonians. And he gets there and says, why are all these Israelites here? Send them home. Send home the Hebrews. So they go back home in 539 and they begin the process of rebuilding. Nehemiah comes along. They build the outer walls. Things are going great. They build the foundation of the temple. They put an altar there. Ezra reminds the people of the law of God and what they ought to do. And they start to get their life back together. And then they stop for 15 years. So they build the walls, give them protection. They build their own houses, get those in order, build the foundation of the temple, and then they stop for 15 years.